We have a great guest speaker here who I've known for many years here in Eugene, believe it or not, and who's been incredibly supportive of change in the mental health system. She's had a number of speakers there who are psychiatric survivors and advocates for change. And she's a senior instructor in the University of Oregon, and she'll be talking about how we can regain dignity and trust and humanity in the mental health system through what she calls authentic relationships. So a big round of applause for Pam Birrell.
Thank you, everyone. Is this good enough here? Okay. As David said, I am an instructor at the University of Oregon. I have taught there for 25 years or so. At the same time, I have been working in private practice. I'm a psychologist. I was trained initially at Community Mental Health Center in North Portland. Before trauma became a big thing, it was in 1985-86. Judy Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, didn't come out till 1992. But I did, during that time, I did a rotation on my internship at the state hospital. I worked in a very, 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 very rough neighborhood in North Portland. And I remember thinking at the time, there's an awful lot of trauma here. And wondering if these people that I was seeing really needed therapy or if they needed money and support. I became gradually, actually there was a moment when I became disenchanted with the mental health system. I had worked in the state hospital and felt kind of crazy the whole time I was there. It was at Damish up there in Wilsonville before it closed. And I kept thinking the whole time that something was just kind of strange about the whole situation. Psychologists, as you may or may not know, in especially a state hospital setting, are kind of extra baggage. The psychiatrists are the real people. And I used to have to do things like testing to find out if a person who came into the hospital was really psychotic or whether perhaps they were having a drug reaction. Now my thought at the time was, we could just wait and see. But no, I was paid to do this testing, so I tested and found out a few things. I was also initially trained as a social psychologist. And in social psychology, one of the things you learn that's really, really important is the power of the situation. There were some famous studies done in the 70s and 80s in social psychology. There's the Milgram experiment, which you may or may not have heard of. And the Zimbardo prison experiment, which was hardly an experiment, but an interesting demonstration of the overwhelming power of the situation and how the situation itself can cause us to act in crazy, harmful, aggressive, evil ways. And so I was very well aware of the power of the situation. And it wasn't until a couple of years after my experience with the state hospital, I went like, duh, that's my problem. I had the assumption that the patients were crazy and the system was sane. And as soon as I adjusted that set of assumptions, that the patients weren't crazy, but the system was, everything fell into place for me. And that's where it's been ever since. And so gradually over the years in my teaching, I've become more and more bold. I teach psychopathology at the University of Oregon. I teach psychology of trauma. I teach a course called Culture and Mental Health, which introduces the role of culture. And this spring, I'm going to teach a course on dreams. So it's really been fun to be able to teach these courses and gradually introduce students to some more radical ideas. In the 90s, when I was teaching psychopathology, I used a standard psychopathology textbook. This is depression, this is schizophrenia, this is anxiety, alongside Peter Bregan's toxic psychiatry book. This greatly confused the students, which is actually my goal. That I want the students to really be able to think about things in complex ways and see people as individuals instead of members of diagnostic categories. Back during that time, I was called on the carpet by a local psychiatrist. I was consulting with her on a particular person, and she said to me, "Oh, by the way, I hear you're using this book in your classes." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, you know you shouldn't be doing that." And I said, "Oh, really?" And she said, "Well, people might go off their meds." And I said, "So?" "Well, they might miss class." So anyway, that was back in the 90s. I took a hiatus from the class, and now back teaching it again, and I do something similar, but I have the students read a standard psychopathology text, and then I have them read Anatomy of an Epidemic by Bob Whitaker. That really fires them up. And he has been generous enough that I emailed him and asked him, the students, every single student, and I have 65 or 70 students in a class, writes him an email asking a question about his book, bringing suggestions to his book, and he answers every single one of them. So it really has been a wonderful experience for the students to be able to actually email the author of a book. It's also been very fun to watch them get confused and mad about the whole system. During the time I've been teaching this, I have been pursuing a different kind of study. There is a kind of therapy. It's actually one of the top 10 therapies, according to the American Psychological Association, and I am an advanced practitioner in what is called relational cultural theory. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about tonight, is relational cultural theory. I've been studying this for probably 15 years. And as I say, I became an advanced practitioner in the program. The history of that program began with Jean Baker Miller, who was a psychiatrist. She died about 5 years ago. She wrote in 1976 a book called Towards a New Psychology of Women. And in that book, she proposed a wonderfully simple model of psychopathology. She said, and this was, back then it was about women, now it's about all people. She said, you know what? When people have healthy relationships, they develop in psychologically healthy ways. The end. That's a whole theory. Now, there's a bunch of different ideas that I want to introduce you to tonight, and also give you an example of a person that I've seen in applying this relational cultural theory. But relational cultural theory is an extremely subversive theory. What it attempts to do is undermine the whole model of individuals' pathology and put it in a relational perspective. So in standard therapy, there's the client who has problems and the therapist who is the guide. And we have a whole culture around therapy and a whole culture around the therapist. Relational cultural theory attempts to undermine and interrogate this system. And one of its core assumptions is something called condemned isolation. And what that is, it's the most terrifying and destructive feeling that a person can experience is isolation. This is not the same as being alone in the more straightforward sense. This is feeling locked out of the possibility of human connection. Along with it usually goes the feeling of the inability to change the situation, or powerlessness, and the sense that it is one's own fault. And this often happens, as we know now from many studies, that if you look at people who get psychiatrically hospitalized or get in therapy, the role of trauma is exceedingly high. That these people have been traumatized by sexual abuse, emotional abuse, any number of things. I'm also at present writing a book with my friend Jennifer Fried on betrayal. She developed, and this goes along with relational cultural theory, she developed something called betrayal trauma theory. We usually think of trauma as something like an automobile accident, a hurricane, or war. She introduced, or perhaps reintroduced, because this kind of thing is actually found in psychoanalytic thinking, but she introduced the idea of relational trauma. And that is betrayal. And I'd like you to do maybe something from the book for a minute. In the book we ask, think of a time when you were betrayed. It might have been a huge betrayal, maybe sexual abuse when you were a child. It might have been a betrayal like your romantic partner tells you they can't go to an event, you go by yourself and you find that person there with another person. Or perhaps a friend of yours betrays a confidence. And think about, for a minute, that betrayal and how you felt. Think about what feelings you had, what you did, what kind of support you had. I think we can all agree that when you are betrayed like that, there is a sense, especially right when you find out about it, or right when it happens, of free fall or disorientation. You don't know what's true. You don't know who to believe. You don't know if you're crazy. You don't know if the other person is crazy. And if you're an adult, and if you have enough power in the relationship, you can figure it out. Right? You can kind of talk to people. You can get mad at your partner. You can do any number of things and you can figure it out. If the relationship, if you're powerless, as a child often is, or a client is, or a patient in a doctor's office, if you're powerless and you're betrayed, you need that relationship. Maybe you don't really, but you believe that you need that relationship. And so you can't face that betrayal. So you go into this kind of psychological freefall, clutching for explanations that might help you understand what was going on. In the case of children who are traumatized, they often latch on to the explanation that they're bad or that they're crazy. Patients often, well, they're helped to latch on to the explanation that they're crazy. Their doctor didn't do anything. And so you have these two interlocking lines of thought. One is this idea that healthy relationships are imperative for healthy development. That when we are betrayed, especially if we're powerless, we're stuck in this state of condemned isolation and begin to think we're crazy, or maybe continue to think we're crazy, or maybe we get feeling crazier. So the whole goal of therapy, from the aspect of relational cultural theory, is to develop a good relationship with a person, is to understand that when people are traumatized and betrayed, they learn to keep parts of themselves out of connection in order to maintain connection. Okay, so if you're a child and you're taught, especially a girl, and you're taught that anger is unacceptable, you learn to keep that out of connection. If you're a boy, often in our culture, you're taught that vulnerability is unacceptable, and you keep that out of connection. And you gradually isolate more and more parts of yourself. And when you do that, you can't grow and change. One of the things we're learning about from the new neuroscience is that our systems are what are called complex systems. And complex systems need to be able to change to grow. And if you're stuck in a place where you can't change because you've got parts of yourself stuck out of connection that you can't bring into a relationship with anyone, you can't grow and change. And the most extreme case of this, of course, can be seen in people who get diagnosed with dissociative identity. I won't even call it a disorder, with dissociative identities. Those people learn that there's parts of themselves that cannot be in connection. However, since we yearn for human connection, that's how we're made. We are social beings. We know this from the new neuroscience. Mirror neurons, the whole sense of things. We yearn for wholeness. We yearn for connection. When there's a part of you out of connection, either you shut down, become depressed and anxious, or perhaps that part of you that's out of connection tries to find a way for connection that looks, quotes, pathological. So that's the whole outline of it. I guess I can stop. Okay. So a relational cultural therapist doesn't diagnose, doesn't really pay much attention to diagnostic categories. They're interested in developing something called mutual empathy. A relational cultural therapist is very alive and active in the relationship, is very much attending to the quality of the relationship rather than what's going on with the, quotes, patient. The relational cultural therapist attends to the impact of the power on therapy and other relationships. They're very well aware. I am very well aware when I'm a therapist of my power, and my power to harm as well as my power to hurt. And so I pay attention to that. I was with somebody yesterday, and sometimes I'm a good therapist and sometimes I just make the same mistake over and over again. And one of the mistakes I make is offering suggestions when I shouldn't. So I did this yesterday, and the person I was with kind of shut down. And so we stopped and found out that when I'd offered the suggestion, it was something that she wasn't sure she could do and thought maybe she should do it, and so she started to diminish. She started to pull out of the connection. But I've been trained, and I think it's one of the most important things is to pay attention to being alive in the connection, so we stopped. And we looked at what had happened. And I remember saying, oh, I did it again, didn't I? And she, at this point, could say, yeah, you did it again. And bring herself back into the connection. One of the other things we do as relational cultural therapists is that we honor the strategies of disconnection. If you can't always be in connection, it can feel very dangerous, especially if you have a history of betrayal and trauma. Opening yourself up to a new person is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And so sometimes people have to disconnect. And sometimes those strategies of disconnection can look like what traditional psychiatry calls pathology. It can be things like cutting. It can be things like rage. It can be things like depression, and occasionally I'll have someone that won't talk, right? Now, is this person being manipulative, trying to get me to work hard? Or is this person disconnecting to protect themselves somehow? And so we learn to honor those strategies rather than pathologizing them. And then we understand something called relational and controlling images. All of us have a relational history. We have a history with relationships, right? And so out of that history with relationships, we develop what are called relational images, which are kind of expectations about what might happen in a relationship. So you might expect from your history to be rejected in a relationship. And so what you might do is act in such a way that you are rejected. Right? So you might get angry and you're rejected, and see, there's the relational image. And so as a therapist, relational cultural therapists are very tuned in to what might be going on. What is this person's relational images? And what's going on? But more importantly, we pay attention to our own relational images, because the therapist is part of the relationship. We don't stand apart from it. We've got certain relational images, and I'm going to describe, when I get to my person that I'm going to describe, how my relational images got in the way of what was going on in the therapy room. The other thing we have are called controlling images. The big controlling image for a therapist is, I should be doing something to help. What I'm doing, I'm just sitting here listening. I don't know, I better offer a suggestion. That's my downfall. And so those controlling images about what we should be doing as therapists often enter the therapy room and disrupt the relationship. So we learn to be tuned into these things. So the goal of relational cultural therapy is to reverse what we call the central relational paradox. And what that means is that in the face of repeated experiences of disconnection, people yearn even more for relationships. However, they also become so afraid of engaging with others that they keep an important part of themselves out of relationships. They develop techniques for staying out of the relationship. And so the therapist tries to be empathic with both sides of the relational paradox, yearning for connection and the strategies of disconnection. And try to help both the therapist, both us and the client, go back into what is called growth-fostering connections. And we do this through, there are some ideas that we have about mutual empathy, but increasing empathic responsiveness in the context of interpersonal mutuality. So it's one of the overall goals is mutuality. This is not a relationship where I'm controlling or they're controlling, but it's a mutual relationship. And so we become mutually affected and being affected, knowing and being known. And each individual, both of us in this dyad, allows and assists the other to become more fully into clarity, reality, and relatedness. We each shape the other. I think one of the big differences in the theoretical aspect of relational cultural therapy and standard therapy is it is expected the therapist gets changed. Absolutely. My entire system has been changed. The way I think about things has been changed by the people that I work with. One of my recent interests has been in the field of ethics and psychotherapy. And I firmly believe that if a therapist or somebody in power goes into a relationship with someone of lesser power, what we call a client or a patient or a consumer, whatever we want to call them, and is not willing to be changed themselves, they are acting unethically. You have to be ready to have your entire theoretical frame changed. You've got to be willing to have your entire emotional frame changed. And if you're not willing to do that, you're behaving unethically. But I've got some really boring papers about that. You don't want to hear about that. Relational cultural theory tries to go beyond the individual to the whole idea of relationality and relational being, rather than one individual, another individual. We each have our own pathologies. It's about relational being. And so we try to move toward mutuality and mutual empathy. We try to develop something called anticipatory empathy. That is, and this is where I blew it the other day when I made my suggestion. I should have known this person would not probably react in a good way. So I failed on anticipatory empathy in that particular session. We try to be open to being influenced. We enjoy relational curiosity. We look at vulnerability and authenticity as good things. Often when I talk about relational cultural therapy, people say, so you just say whatever comes into your head? No. It's about being very, very attuned to the relationship, aware of the other person, using anticipatory empathy, using mutual empathy, and knowing and learning times when I can confront, times when I need to be more gentle, and just paying very, very close attention. I also have to be able to be vulnerable to the other person. And that means being affected by their story. I was talking to a graduate student at the U of O today, and I supervise her. She works at the Center for Community Counseling, and she was saying that she hugged a client. And I said, okay. And she said that she took a course where they were taught not to. And I said to her, so you're taught not to treat the people you see as human beings? And she thought about it a minute, and she said, well, I guess so. And so I try to go beyond that kind of model of the therapist as guide or whatever it is, whatever that model is. I didn't ask too much about it because I thought it was bad. And so we look toward empowering the other, giving a life-giving, growth-fostering relationship. Let me see before I want to go on to the next thing. think that's about, before I go in talking about the person I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to talk about a couple of people. I'd like to stop for a minute and see if there are any questions about what I've said.
Well, one thing I neglected to do is I should have mentioned that we have a little panel of mental health consumers, and so we wanted to give them a first chance to respond. And Jerry Smith is a mental health consumer, longtime advocate with Homeless, who is on this brand new task force on homelessness, the Community Task Force on Homelessness. And as far as I can tell, one of the few out-of-the-closet mental health consumers on the task force. And then T.C. Dumas is, I call T.C. a walking coalition. From all the work that you've done, went from forced electroshock as a teenager to a PhD in sociology from the University of Oregon. So we're going to let them have a first chance to see if they have any questions or comments, and then open it up a little bit, and then we'll hear more from Pam. So, Jerry? Or TC?
Well, of course, dealing with homelessness in here in Eugene, it just ties in completely with what you just said. People are literally abandoned. They haven't got any reason to hope for anything. There's no government safety net for most of them. It takes months and years. If a person with a disability applies, you have to have a really good advocate. The city has no plan dealing with the homeless. The state backed away from their plans for dealing with the homeless. They had a program called General Assistance that helped people in the time that they waited to get on Social Security disability. They ended that and turned 3,000 disabled people homeless in the day they ended it. And it's just geometrically gotten larger every year since. And people come to me and they say, well, I got a back problem, so how can I apply for disability? I said, anybody who's homeless for 2 weeks diagnostically is depressed and anxious. And there's no way they can prove they're not, because they absolutely are. One or two people who are euphoric by nature might not fall on that level, but then again, the diagnosis, if they're euphoric when they're hopeless, it's very clear that that's a functional mental illness. I've had a lot of training, and it's been very eclectic over the years. It feels very compatible with what you said. And my own experience, at one point, I was training with a bunch of psychologists, social workers, and psychiatrists in a group method. And we were regressing to going back to where we were when we were kids. And all I could do was groan. And the leader told everybody in the room, including my wife, that I was mentally ill. And I've got to tell you, I had a wonderful grandmother who, when I was about 18 months, told my mother she couldn't touch me anymore. And I lived with my grandmother until I was 10. And that's why I was groaning about being back in that period. To some people it looked like mental illness, but to me it was just reality.
Thanks, Jerry. TC?
I guess I like the whole idea of relational cultural therapy. I don't know how it will fit into our community here in our nation. That's, like how do we change a system where it's built on a power structure, us and them relationship, and where there's supposed to be boundaries, certain boundaries set. that you do not cross, and also how, I mean, I guess teaching people, therapists, and as well as, I guess, clients or patients to not cross certain boundaries, and where those boundaries, what are those boundaries, and I don't know how that is going to happen in our society, as far as the hugging and all that, and being real. Some people are afraid that if you react like you cry in front of, if you have tears in your eyes because someone's telling their story, then you can't help them, that you are being you're getting too emotional, you're getting too invested, you're getting too into their, to where you won't be able to help them. And you're making them take on what you should be taking on. You're making them take on your problem. You're making them feel bad because you're feeling bad. And the other thing that I was thinking is that I like what you said about the honoring the strategies of disconnection, and I think of the ways that people protect themselves and what they do to protect themselves, and there's a whole lot of things. I mean, some people drink, some people, gamble, some people cut, some people burn, some people, dissociate, some people, use anger, act out. But one of the things that that I thought about was that term borderline, and which I hate, so that, I don't know, anyway, I thought about that when you were talking about, people, having their strategies of disconnect and of coping and of living and surviving, I guess. And that's all I can think of right now because I'm disconnecting.
I do want to say
I'll honor
one
your strategy.
other thing. If you hear somebody who's therapy, try to find out if your insurance or whatever will cover that. You need to shop for a therapist if you have any chance whatsoever. It's one of the most important investments you'll ever make. When I was first very clinically depressed, I went to see a famous psychologist and found out he was more depressed than I was. And he really wasn't any help. He just talked theory, and we didn't get anywhere. And shortly thereafter, I found somebody who was really upbeat and understood and was empathic and turned me around.
Okay, good questions about boundaries. I think what we do in the mental health profession often is create what we call borderlines. We offer things to people that we can't give them, and they get angry, and then we continue to pathologize them. So I think, I probably shouldn't admit this, and something's going to be on YouTube, but I've never really understood this idea of boundaries. The phrase that we use in relational cultural therapy is clarity of relationship. And I can be very clear about what I can provide and what I can't provide. That's a much better term for me than boundary. And you can think of perhaps boundary, if you want to, as a meeting place rather than a dividing line. So that's how I think about the whole idea of boundaries when I understand it. So let me tell you about Charles. I first met Charles when I was working at a community mental health center in that very impoverished area of Portland. It was an agency that provided services including social work, case management, psychotherapy, and psychiatry. Charles is Charles's mother had called the clinic about her son, who at the time was 30 years old and hadn't left the house since he was 13. In addition to being agoraphobic, Charles was angry, depressed, and increasingly difficult for her to manage. Before I met Charles for psychotherapy, he had met a social worker who helped him leave the house for the first time in all those years. She also went with him to do things like get his hair cut and go to the grocery store. When she brought him to the clinic, he was frightened and overwhelmed and covered it with a layer that alternated between icy cold condescension and depressed hopelessness. Slowly, I managed to get his story. His parents had divorced when he was 5. When his father left the home, so did his 4 older brothers. Charles was then left with his mother and older sister. He rarely saw his father and brothers after they left, but when he did, they were distant and condescending, often making fun of him for the girly way he was acting and telling him to go back where he belonged. Charles's mother was a case in herself. She was alternately smothering and rejecting, first telling him that she could not survive if he ever left her, and then berating him for not getting on with his own life. His older sister had left home only to become institutionalized and unable to live on her own. Charles was terrified of ending up like his sister, but longed for a life of his own, and he was incredibly isolated. Charles was and still is one of the most intelligent people I've ever worked with. Charles taught me a very important lesson: don't argue with your clients because you'll probably lose. He had spent his years in isolation in his house, first earning a GED, which he finished by the age of 15, and then reading almost every book he could find. His favorite topics were science fiction, and he understood the science of it, and psychology. By the time he arrived at the clinic, he virtually memorized the then DSM-3R and was demanding a quick and competent treatment for his many disorders: social phobia, body dysmorphic disorder, dysthymia, generalized anxiety disorder, and perhaps borderline personality disorder. He was impatient with his life and with me. Charles was difficult to deal with. His relational images that I talked about earlier revolved around shame and betrayal. He kept himself out of connection with others by using his massive intellect, his incisive anger, and his keen wit. Early attempts that I made, being empathic with Charles, were met with mocking and judgment. Charles felt I didn't know the DSM well enough to help him and requested a change of therapists. When this proved not to be possible, Charles only reluctantly agreed to continue with me, and I'll have to say I was a bit reluctant at the time too. He made fun of me. He got angry with me. He stormed out a couple of times. His relational images was that his strategies of disconnection were intellectual and angry. Now, the relationship was difficult because I had my own strategies of disconnection. I was raised in an academic family where only intellect was acceptable, and this left me very vulnerable to Charles's attacks. His strategies of disconnection matched mine only too well. His attacks on my competence activated my controlling images of not being a good enough therapist, and his attempts to replace me felt humiliating. I despaired of not being good enough, and I was tempted to withdraw inside my intellect just as he had withdrawn inside his. After all, I told myself, I do have a PhD, and I had to keep reminding myself of that fact. Although he saw it as meaning little enough since I hadn't memorized the DSM. I longed to tell him I thought it was a pile of crap, but I didn't think he was ready for that. So our connection was very, very difficult. I was scared. He was scared. We used our strategies of disconnection very effectively with each other. And so it took a while for us to gradually find those smaller places of connection. On occasion, I was able to find out one true thing to say, and he was able to take it in. There's a wonderful paper called One True Thing, where if you could just find one little tiny place to connect. With Charles, I had in high school and college had a big thing about science fiction. Now, I didn't understand the science of it, but I liked science fiction. So if he talked about a book that I had read, I was quick to say I'd read it. He was also then quick to demonstrate to me I hadn't understood what I had read, but he at least could understand that I was trying to connect with him. And so I gradually became able to meet his condescension with softness instead of defensiveness. And understanding, this is where it's so important to understand those strategies of disconnection. Understanding that it's attacks on me were designed only to protect those vulnerable parts of him that have been so badly hurt. He expected, because of the treatment of his father and his mother, of being rejected. He continued to be frustrated with me because he wanted answers, and I only valued connection. But we kept on going. I remember one time, I was teaching at the time, and we were watching cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm a lousy cognitive behavioral therapist. And I tell students that I'm bad. But I watched a film on it. So I go in and see Charles, and I say, so I saw this video, and what do you think about trying this? And I explained to him the whole theory behind cognitive therapy and the dysfunctional thoughts and things like that. And he just looked down his nose at me and he said, Pam, given my background, the thoughts that I have make complete sense. They're not dysfunctional. Shut me up. So we kept going. We began actually to have some fun together and he was able to gain some perspective on his difficulties. He was extremely shame-based. He was so ashamed. He would watch too much TV and be ashamed of it. And so I found that sort of as a central part of him is that he was so, I could just say the slightest thing off and he could feel so shamed. And then he would go into his strategies. But we became more and more able to enter into connection. And at one point he asked me to read a book, science fiction book. Now, it was well past my science fiction phase then, but it was important to me to connect with Charles, so I read the book. It's called The Mote in God's Eye. Has anyone ever read it? Yeah. Terrible book. It was written in 1975 by Larry Niven and Jerry Cornell, and he was very insistent that I read it, so I did. It was a long book, and I read it. And came back in. Luckily, I knew Charles fairly well by now, and we weren't engaging in so many strategies of disconnection. And I said, okay, I read it. Don't quiz me on the science. Now tell me why you wanted me to read it. And he looked at me like I was crazy. But at this point, he'd learned to care about me, and we'd gotten some mutual empathy going. And this book is about a civilization of motis, M-O-T-I-E-S. And the Motis were an extremely hierarchical civilization that the creatures, and they were more like, I remember them being described like little bears, but I don't know if that's right. But they were stuck in this endless cycle of wars. And most of them were resigned to these never-ending cycles. What would happen is they have a big war, and then things would go along okay, but then the population would increase until they'd have another war. And so they were just caught in this endless cycle. There was nothing that they could do about it. This whole civilization felt like there was nothing they could do about it. But there was this mythical character called Crazy Eddie. And this Crazy Eddie would come in every 1,000 years or so. And Crazy Eddie would believe there was a way to change this. And so any Modi who came to believe that a solution to this unending cycle of population up and down and war was known as a Crazy Eddie. And I said, oh, okay. I looked at him blankly. And he said, well, don't you see? What? He said, don't you see you're Crazy Eddie? And at first I was appalled, but then he explained it to me. And these are actually Charles's words. He wrote them to me later. He said, Crazy Eddie is the concept of hoping when there is no good reason for hope, something we do because of our ability to depart from sterile facts. It implies a leap of logic not of logic, but of love, sometimes self-love. Eddie is insane, but exemplifies divine insanity. That is, Eddie is the guy who jumps into icy water to help a drowning person knowing he's got about a minute before he'll need to be saved himself. Or the woman who keeps believing in her daughter even after the girl attempts suicide. Eddie leaves a secure job to become an artist, or buys a house in a war zone because it's so beautiful, or decides to go visit church with people his parents taught him were damned. Eddie is uniquely human because you can't depart from logic unless the logic is there to start with. A mama cat rescuing her kitten from a burning building is heartwarming and courageous, but not Crazy Eddie, because she doesn't know as much about burning buildings as we do or how dangerous it is. She does what she has to. Eddie, on the other hand, is aware and still works for the survival of the soul. He's the lone rabbi who observes Sabbath in Nazi Germany as long as he can, and the homemaker with 8 kids who passes the bar exam, and the therapist who believes a client can turn their life around and be whole, with very few tools other than their own faltering spirit. Depending on the perspective, he can appear foolish or heroic, but I think he's somewhere in between, and he's definitely nuts. Eddie is the personification of hope and love of life. Really now, what's crazier than that, given how ugly life can be? Charles went on to finish college. He's now working at a large company in Portland, and I have no doubt he'll continue to be very successful. He really taught me a bunch of things. He taught me the importance of hope, and I believe that relational cultural theory, in trying to connect with people at their where they feel the craziest, where they feel the most hopeless, rather than trying to cover it over, reduce symptoms, can really bring back hope. He taught me about the importance of being open to connection, as all of the people I work with do. And he taught me the importance of being nuts in a world that considers sanity to be the loneliness of the bounded ego. And so Charles taught me a lot, and I'm eternally grateful to him. So that's what I have to say.
Very good. This is where I get to be Oprah,
Okay.
and I have an extra microphone, and Oprah never gives up her mic.
Okay.
Testing. So if you could mention your name, maybe, if you want to, if you have a question or comment first, because it's a chance for us to get to know each other. But I really appreciated everything you said. And can we call you Crazy Eddie when we see you?
Absolutely. I'm really happy.
Now I'm going to get your right photograph up there, Crazy Eddie. All right, so who would like to make a comment or question? And then all three will have an option if they wish. They don't have to briefly respond. Keep your comments fairly brief, and you'll have a chance to ask another question or comment later on. And of course, we have the wonderful Hugh Massengill, who has taught me a lot about trauma and connection and support.
As they say, I should quit right now before I say anything. Pam, where does family fit into this? Because it seems like for a lot of people, becoming healthy means abandoning that primary relationship. Mm-hmm. So where does family come in?
Or maybe they've already been abandoned.
Yeah, that's probably where it comes from.
One of the things I really appreciate are the relational therapies, the family therapy movement. And I have some training in it, I'm not very good at it, but I think the whole idea of getting people to, there's two points to your question. One is, can people reconnect with their family? And if not possible, when they leave that family behind, how can they learn new ways of connecting? And how can it be safe for them to connect? I'm working with someone right now whose family was, I can't even describe to you how abusive the family was. And she would be diagnosed with DID and went into extreme isolation. And for her, learning to trust again has been extremely hard because of all the betrayals in the past. So I would like, when I can, to get people reconnected with their family, but that's just not always possible. And they have to learn to go on.
I was just thinking that a lot of the time the family is the problem, And they are the cause of a lot of the things, and there's a lot of agencies who work with people with disabilities who are intent on believing the family or making the family be the ones that help this their child or their relative, and I think find that a lot of times pretty damaging. And other times there's, I think there's a certain way that healing can be brought on by just letting the person who is so-called mentally ill be the one to guide the direction of that relationship, and how and just show you what the relationship was like, what they want it to be like, and what they want to do with it, if anything at all.
Well, I think sometimes I felt better when I lived 3,000 miles away from my family and saw them on occasion. My mother was a contrarian, which meant that she'd always argue whatever he had to say. And as a teenager, instead of being constantly beat down by it, I learned to play games with it. And one of the games I liked to do was change to her point of view. And within a couple of paragraphs, she would then argue against her point of view. And I could see it and think it was funny. And it really was her way of connecting with me. Her way of connecting with the world was to be challenging. But it was a lot to take all the time. So it was better being a good distance away.
Thank you. And Crazy Eddie, we have a new Oprah, because I had double vaccinations today and I'm like a little woozy. So Ron Unger, who by the way is listed in our Mind Freedom Directory of Mental Health Alternatives. If you Google that, you'll find my counselor, Ron Unger, and if there's a counselor here or therapist, just sign up and you can be listed there as supporting our principles for therapists that help people that have been traumatized by therapists.
So, in my impression of doing therapy, it's a relationship of love. And that's the primary force that's there. And what is necessary for that relationship to bear fruit is that the therapist not be in a role, that you quit thinking of the relationship as one of a professional and service provider to somebody in need, and more as one human being standing with another human being in a fully transparent way,
Right.
which involves a lot more self-disclosure than is ordinarily considered appropriate in graduate school training. And also, a major piece of this is something that your client made a point of, is that sometimes you have to hold the hope when everything seems hopeless.
Absolutely. These ideas are not new. We keep trying to reframe them. It's clearly what we're talking about is an I-thou relationship. We're talking about Martin Buber. We're talking about love, right? And we keep trying to put them in new packages so that people will hear them. But that's exactly what it is. And you do have to hold the hope sometimes. It can be very, very difficult through dark, dark, dark times. Yeah, thank you.
I want to say that another thing that I found useful to myself, and certainly to the others, was to say that they were the expert on who they are and what they can do. I have no opinion about that, other than I trust them to eventually put that into practice, as you say, and be hopeful that eventually that will happen.
have an excellent article called The Client is Expert, Therapy of Not Knowing. One of the other tenets of relational cultural theory is the ability to be in not knowing and to be in ambiguity without an irritable reaching after facts, which is a Keats quote. So we have to be willing to stay open and not know. And I think that when we pretend we know, that's when we get into trouble. That's when we're acting unethically.
My name's Steve, and this all makes sense. It's great, but I must be misunderstanding something. You said that if people have healthy relationships, they turn into healthy people. Well, we know that 1 in 100 babies, when they're born, they're severely disabled by something. It just seems like it's a remote. I must be missing something, because that seems too simplistic and naive. What am I missing?
It's when they're in healthy relationships, they develop in healthy ways. And that's going to look different for everyone.
Every time?
Every time. That's it.
Maybe it would be clearer if you explained that, like, somebody born with a developmental disability
Right?
that created cognitive impairment,
Uh-huh.
they can still grow with healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
They may have severe cognitive difficulties, but we have some amazing members who contribute a lot and have healthy lives and are included in the community. Is that kind of
Yeah,
what you're
it's just
saying?
not going to look like, I mean, I love the 10 warning signs of normality. It's just not going to look normal, perhaps.
One of the peer counselors I trained was born of a mother who took thalidomide while she was a baby. She had no legs. Her right arm ended at the elbow and had kind of like a thumb on it. And she had a strong left arm. And she was a very small Filipino woman. And people had to carry her. She couldn't get into medical school because it was on the second floor. And she couldn't find anybody to carry her up to the second floor. She was a brilliant person, and I helped her get into the Graduate School of Social Work, and she was exceptional and just a totally wonderful therapist.
I've maybe got something to say as Oprah here. I think one thing that's tricky is that we often have this idea that if you're like a good parent could be standardized and would be the good parent for everyone. But in fact, since kids aren't all the same, being a parent, you have to be constantly kind of like discovering what makes healthy relationship for this child. What do they need? And that's varying all the times. And sometimes what really throws parents off is they figure, well, I'm doing just what the people down the street are doing, and that should be helping my kid. And if my kid isn't getting better, there must be something wrong with my kid. Well, often it's a mismatch in that you have to think of something else to do in order to help that person. If you look at this as a systems kind of thing, it's kind of interesting because instead of seeing the problem inside a person, you realize that if you enter into a relationship with someone, this is the way I just wrote about it to somebody this morning, you either become part of the problem or part of the solution. And as therapists, we often do a little of both, but we're trying to become part of the solution. And it's really easy to, say the wrong thing or come at it the wrong way and inadvertently be making the problem worse. But a sensitive therapist is always trying to make it better. And so if they see they're making it worse, they go, oh, what just happened? I think I did something maybe wrong. It didn't work for you, or it's not helping. Should I be doing something else?
They might even apologize.
Oh, yeah.
I want to say one more thing about family. A fellow came to me and he wanted to stop shouting at his daughter. And he seemed very middle class and whatever, and I was wondering whether he had a bad job or what was making him so grouchy. And one of my stretches is to ask people about their family. And I found out that his grandfather had gotten so upset with his father that he beat him and left him dead in the woods. And the father had been raised by somebody else. The father had tried to overcome the anger that he had, but while the man that I met, looking middle class, was a youngster, his father got so angry with him he broke his arm. So in 3 generations they've come from being monstrous to being out of control to being really doing the best they possibly knew how. And so that's the kind of hope I have for people. It isn't the family you come from, it's who you are.
I was just going to continue on something that you had said about families and how we all tend to wonder why when we're doing something that a family close to us is doing and it's not working the same way. My question to that is, why does our society still think like that? Why do parents think that there are these like clear-cut solutions for their kids and things? I mean, I understand it's just like something that's been passed down to our society and things, but why is it that we can't break that cycle? It's like every generation of new parents grow up think that they have to look to these books or look to these professionals for their kids as if they know what their kid is going to be like and how they're going to relate to that child.
Oh my gosh, that's such a complicated question. It speaks to how the human psyche operates, how human society operates, and how power operates.
Right. Well, I think that's all very much connected to this whole issue too.
Absolutely, and the whole mental health system. It's like, who's the professional? Who knows what's going on? And not having that tolerance for not knowing. I mean, we're taught that we need to be right. We need to be effective. And so we get afraid to ask. And so we cover up and keep trying what's not working.
Glenn Dwyer said, friends are God's apology for having family.
I'm just wondering, I'm glad to hear your thoughts on the DSM, and I'm Tom Wilson, by the way. I just wondering, in your teaching, how much of the teaching is looking at ways to find out what's right rather than what's wrong with somebody? You see what I'm saying? Is how much is taught about how people recover rather than the pathology of a person?
Not very much. I had a GTF last spring who taught a lecture on positive psychology, but psychology is still slanted toward what's wrong and how do we fix it. And I think that's something that we really, really need to be looking at. I mean, there's movements, right? We have Maslow. We have a humanistic movement that's now been pushed to the back because we've gotten so biological. And we just have to keep bringing these things back in new ways that people can hear them. That there is, I like the new phrase, recovery. We can have recovery. We don't have to have symptom reduction. People can recover. And so we just have to keep at it.
One of the theories you can find out there is so-called strength-based psychology, where they actually work with your strengths instead of picking up on your symptoms.
Well, I'm just going to throw this out there. I have a distant relative, lives a long way in Sacramento, California. He's definitely had a lot of disconnect in his life when he's created this system, disconnecting, and he's in real trouble. Could be going to prison real soon. And what do you do there is some connection, like I say, he's a distant relative, but I don't know him. I've been in contact with him a few times over the last few years. Any thoughts?
Well, you know, who is the guy? His name is Dan somebody. He does recovery in Boston.
Oh, well, Dan Fisher.
Dan Fisher.
Yeah.
He's got a great video where he talks about his own psychosis and recovery. And what he says in there is really interesting. He says a couple of things that saved him, and one was his cat. And the other was his brother-in-law, who he didn't know very well, but they would talk a lot about things that had nothing to do with his illness.
Right.
And he looks back in this video to those two things having saved him and brought him out of his psychosis.
So he really did develop a relationship with him.
Right, but it wasn't around his symptoms, it wasn't around anything except for, and I'm trying to figure out what it was. I'm trying to remember what it was, but it was, you know, something to do with something very mundane.
And I guess this is what I knew I would hear, because there's really no way for me to, without becoming more in relationship with this person, to be much of assistance.
Exactly.
Or to maybe give some support to someone who is in relationship with them.
Yeah, that would be something. Yeah.